Okay, another Friday, and we're getting far along in the course. So let me once again begin with a review of the material that was covered in the last lecture. We talked about protists, and one of the things that I emphasized was that protists are what we call paraphyletic. That's because they don't include all of the descendant groups within the eukaryotes. Most eukaryotes are protists, but there are three exceptions: plants, animals, and fungi. We talked about some of the key evolutionary innovations that we associate with protists, and they are multicellularity, but I emphasize that multicellularity is not unique to protists. Obviously, plants, animals, and fungi are multicellular, but also some bacteria are multicellular, so it's not unique to protists. The second thing was the evolution of sex. Remember, I emphasized that sex is important primarily because it leads to offspring which are genetically different from their parent. So when you undergo meiosis, have union of gametes to produce new zygotes, each of those new zygotes is a different shuffling of the genome relative to the parent. And so a pair of parents will produce a genetically diverse array of offspring. And we see that in families. I'm different from my brothers, and siblings typically differ from one another, with the one exception of identical twins who have received exactly the same genetic complement from their two parents. We talked about two theories for the origin of the eukaryotic nucleus, and you should be familiar with those. We talked about how protists move and how they get food. In fact, we talked about three different ways of getting food, and again, you should know all three ways. We talked about the alternation of generations. That's the fact that in protists, some groups of protists, not all, there is an alternation of generations. So part of the life cycle is spent in a haploid phase, and another part of the life cycle is spent in a diploid phase. And we'll see that this arose independently in protists and in plants. We'll see that alternation of generations is an important aspect of plant life cycles in this lecture. We then went on to talk about green plants, and we said that green plants are green algae plus plants, and that constitutes all of the green plants. They're a monophyletic lineage. All of the green plants trace back to a single common ancestor. And then we talked about why do we want to study green plants. Well, that's really pretty obvious because we're dependent on them. We're dependent on them for the air we breathe and for all of the food that we get because they're a primary producer. They do photosynthesis, so they capture light energy. They store that in chemical bonds in the form of glucose and other molecules that we are then able to use for our own energy sources and metabolism. So plants are hugely important to humans. We talked about ecosystem services that are provided by plants. Not only do they evolve oxygen into the atmosphere, which we need for our aerobic metabolism, but they also use carbon dioxide to make complicated molecules like cellulose and lignin and sugars, and they sequester carbon dioxide in the form of lignin and cellulose and wood, so that they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for significant periods of time, on the order of 100 years or more for forests. They also build soil and retain soil. They have an important role in water retention in soil. So there are a lot of ecosystem services provided by plants. One of the interesting areas of ecology today is sort of called economic ecology, which tries to figure out how you assign a monetary value to these kinds of ecosystem services, because being able to assign a monetary value to them helps integrate the costs of conservation efforts into our society. We talked about agriculture, that this was a huge technological transformation in human culture. Humans, modern humans, went along for more than 90% of the history of the human species without practicing agriculture as hunter-gatherers. And then suddenly, recently, in the scale of time of human existence on this earth, they invented agriculture. Not only did they invent it, they invented it independently multiple times at more or less the same period in the history of the human race. And so we had the independent invention of agriculture in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, with grasses like wheat and barley, in China, with rice and soybeans, in Mesoamerica, with maize and squash. Squash might have been one of the first. There are remains of cultivated squash now that are dated back to 10,000 years in Mesoamerica. So the invention of agriculture was probably driven by some outside circumstances that forced humans to adapt to global change. And one of the best hypotheses for that is that the invention of agriculture coincides with the end of the last major period of glaciation. And during that period, we were undergoing global climate change, just as we are now. But one of the features of climate change, and we see it today as well, is greater variation from year to year, greater annual variation in climate. That means that you've got to be protected against the extremes. It's not the mean that matters, it's the extremes, because it's the extremes that are represented in long-term droughts or in long periods of very high temperatures or in excessive storms and so forth. It's the extremes that are the threat. So the thinking is that humans invented agriculture as a kind of insurance against starvation associated with extreme periods of climate disruption, which affected their natural food sources. So that's where we ended up. Now, I'm going to go ahead with the quiz and our regular Friday ritual. So we just put away all your materials, books, computers, cell phones, everything, and we'll give you 60 seconds per question. And when you're all ready, make sure to put your clicker ID and student ID on the quiz for me, all right? Okay. By the way, the midterm is a week from today, and you should all bring Scantron forms with you for the midterm exam. We'll try and have a supply of extra ones in case you forget, but just to be sure that there are no tragedies, please bring your own Scantron form. Yes? I'm sorry? What kind of Scantron? What kind of Scantron form do we need? I don't know the number, it's the red ones. Well, maybe, yeah. Maybe, Dustin, you can post it on the message board. Let's say that. I'll send out an email specifically. Yeah. And let me just say one more thing before we start the quiz. Nobody uses the message board, and I check it every day, several times a day usually. But I get questions individually on my email account. And so I'd rather answer questions so that everybody gets the benefit of the answer. I got one question today or maybe it was from last night, that was something to the effect of, do we have to memorize all the names of all the different lineages that you've put on the board? Well, that's a tricky question to answer, because if I say no, then you're going to assume that you don't need to know the really important things like gymnosperms and angiosperms that we'll talk about today, and I do expect you to know those things. On the other hand, I showed you a picture of the, let's say the bacterial lineages. You know, I don't expect you to memorize the name of every major bacterial lineage, okay? So, but if you have a question like that, try and put it on the message board so that everybody gets the benefit of the answer. Okay, we're all set? Number one, 60 seconds. Okay, question one. Bioremediation refers to the use of bacteria and archaea to synthesize novel organic molecules. Well, we know that's false. We use bioremediation to break down organic molecules from pollution, like oil pollution. Anaerobic respiration is dependent on an abundant supply of free molecular oxygen. False. That's aerobic respiration. It's a little tricky. You have to remember anaerobic versus aerobic. C, the only organisms capable of converting molecular nitrogen to ammonia, a process called nitrogen fixation, are specific bacteria and archaea. That's true. We talked about that. Multicellularity is a key morphological innovation of archaea. False. Archaea are not multicellular. The term, or at least so far as we know at this point in time, we're still studying archaea, the term chemolithotrophs refers to organisms that obtain ATP from sugar. False. I made a point of telling you lithotrophs are organisms that obtain ATP from inorganic molecules, okay? So one of the things to notice here is it says identify the true statement. And then the next two say identify the false statement. So be careful to read the header, because they'll be mixed up like this in the midterm as well. Question two, identify the false statement. Horizontal gene transfer has only been documented among bacteria and archaea. Well, that's false, because we talked about the example of the acquisition of chloroplast and photosynthetic genes by eukaryotes. Sexual reproduction originated in protists. That's true. Protists obtain energy from either ingestion, absorption, or photosynthesis. That's true. Remember, we went through those three ways of getting energy in the last lecture. Many multicellular protists have one phase of their life cycle that is based on a haploid form and another that is based on a diploid form, and this phenomenon is known as the alternation of generations. Well, I just reviewed that. So if you missed this one, you're not listening. Protists acquired photosynthesis from a bacterial endosymbiont. Yes, cyanobacteria, so that's true. Okay, number three. Which statement is false? One hypothesis for the origination of the nuclear envelope is that it is derived from the infoldings of the plasma membrane. Yes, that's in your text, and I talked about it and showed a figure on that Wednesday. Multicellularity evolved a number of times independently. I made a point of that. That's also true. It's pretty remarkable, but it's true. Protists are important in the global carbon cycle. Yes, we talked about that. The calcium carbonate shells, which settle to the ocean bottom and build up to form limestone. The earliest photosynthetic organisms were protists. That's false. They're bacteria. We know that. Protists may use pseudopodia, cilia, or flagella for locomotion. Yes, the pseudopodia is used in amoeboid motion. So that's the quiz. Let's see what the distributions look like. Okay. Question 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, there's a significant number who are getting wrong answers. So really look at, if you got a wrong answer, look at why and try and use that to analyze the way in which I ask these questions so that you'll do better on the midterm, okay? Okay, so let's now move on to finishing what we were talking about. Remember, I showed that graph of wood being the most important source of energy, followed by coal, which peaked at about the beginning of the 20th century, then followed by petroleum. And your book has a nice figure on the formation of coal. Coal deposits formed mostly during the Carboniferous era. It's the complete process by which organic remains, in this case largely of giant ferns, were converted into coal is not completely understood, but it is pretty clear that the process requires water. At that time, during the Carboniferous, life on Earth was mostly terrestrial life, was mostly confined to areas where there was abundant water, swampy environments and so forth. So these giant tree ferns would fall into the water, the swamp, and they would become compressed, and then over eons of time, many millions of years, they would be compressed to the point that it became what we know of as coal. So it's a process of some chemical modification and extreme compression that led to coal. Another important fact about plants is that we get a lot of drugs from them. They're important for human medicine, for health. Not only do we eat them, but we get a lot of sources of medicine. So, you know, atropine from belladonna for dilating the pupils, codeine is a heart medication, so's digitalin from foxglove, again, a heart medication. You know, an interesting one is Taxol from the Pacific Yew, because it's one of the few treatments that can cure ovarian cancer. Very important in the Pacific Yew is an endangered tree, which is likely not to be with us very much longer. Quinine, heart medication, also was used for malarial prevention. Of course, we use aspirin, salicin, for pain relief and for blood thinning. Steroids from wild yams. So there's a lot of different kinds of important medications that come from plants. In fact, plants are really creative chemically. They make a wide variety of very complex, what are called secondary products. These are very complicated carbon ring structures that are often used as a way of poisoning insects and so forth that feed off plants, but some of these molecules have great utility for humans. So plants are great chemists. Okay, how do we study plants? What are the major ways that we study green plants? Well, there are three things that we're going to talk about, and we're going to go through this sequentially. One is morphological comparisons, and we're going to use morphological in the broad sense to include biochemical or structural features as well as just external morphology. We can analyze the fossil record of plants, so that's number two. And number three is that we can assess we can use DNA sequence data as a way of reconstructing phylogenetic histories and then putting on the history where key morphological changes arose. And we'll see examples of that as well. In fact, that'll be an analytical technique that we'll use repeatedly in the next hour or so. So, number one, morphology. What morphological and biochemical features do plants share with green algae? Why do we think that plants and green algae, that plants arose from green algae? Well, the key things are chlorophyll A and B in the photosynthetic machinery. Now, remember, I told you on Wednesday's lecture that chlorophyll A and B harvest light from a particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And they're unique to green algae and to plants. Another is a molecule called beta-carotene. Sorry for the Greek letters. It wasn't that way when I wrote it on the slide. Should have been a beta, but anyway, you learned some Greek here. Then they both have thylakoid membranes, which are membrane-bound sacs that are important in light harvesting. And finally, cell walls of green algae and of plants have a similar chemical composition. So those are 4 strong reasons to think that plants arose from green algae. Now, we're going to, as we look at morphological traits in this sequence of the evolution of plants, we're going to look at structures that are really key. And one of the key structures is the evolution of vascular tissue in plants. Vascular tissue conducts water and nutrients within a plant. Remember, I told you last time that the big problem in occupying the land, the terrestrial environment, the big adaptive problem was to develop structures and adaptations that allowed plants to live out of water, because all of life up to that point had evolved in an aqueous environment. So the key problem was, how do you live out of water? Now, another question we'll ask in a couple of minutes is, why bother, okay? Why do you even want to live out of water? But let's take that as a given for the moment. One of the key structures is vascular tissue, a way of conducting water within the plant. So we're going to look at non-vascular plants. These are early forms of plants that don't have vascular tissue. And these, then we will look at seedless vascular plants. And then, so here is an example of non-vascular plants. These are plants that grow in moist environments because they don't have the tissue to conduct water throughout the body of the plant. They live in very moist environments, and they live close to the ground. They're small, prostrate life forms. Why are they prostrate? Because the key structural component for plants is also the vascular tissue. So vascular tissue gets used to solve 2 big problems in plant evolution. One is the conducting of water and nutrients throughout the plant, but the other big problem is to provide the structural support for plants to grow high into the air. So these are non-vascular plants. They're among the earliest of the plant lineages beginning to occupy the terrestrial environment. We have liverworts, hornworts, mosses. You see mosses when you walk through the forest. So they're a common feature of everyday life. And the next group are seedless vascular plants in this sequence as we move up in the acquisition of 2 key adaptations. In seedless vascular plants include things like the club mosses, the whisk ferns, horsetails, and ferns. Well, ferns are common also when you walk in the forest. You're all familiar with ferns. They have vascular tissue, but they do not produce seeds. And then the next key thing in this analysis of morphological traits is the appearance of seeds. Well, why are seeds important? They're important because they enclose an embryo with nutritive tissue. So they're giving a new embryo the resources it needs to get a start in life. It's like an inheritance to the next generation. And so the seed can use that nutritive tissue to germinate, to grow up to the point where it can begin to, where it receives light and it can begin to photosynthesize. So seed plants have vascular tissue and they make seeds. That's pretty obvious. It's hard to make a tricky question out of that. So here's some example of seed plants. The cycads, ginkgo, redwoods, and junipers and yews, neophytes, pines, spruces, and firs, and finally, the flowering plants, the angiosperms. The flowering plants are really important today, and we'll see more as we go along. So within seed plants, there are 2 big groups, two phyla that we're concerned with. The gymnosperms, and they include all of the conifers that you're familiar and walking through the forests and so forth, and the flowering plants, or angiosperms. The gymnosperm produces seeds, but the seeds do not develop in an enclosed structure. Gymnosperm means naked seed, okay? Gymnosperm. The angiosperms, on the other hand, the seeds develop in a protective structure called a carpel. So that's the key difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay, so we've talked very briefly about some big morphological features: vascular tissue, seed, whether the seed develop in enclosed structures or not. Now we're going to look at the use of the fossil record to analyze from fossil remains the evolution of some of these big traits. The first thing to say is that the plant fossil record, so far as we know today, and it's very extensive, so this is probably not going to change much, goes back about 475 million years. Okay, so plants really began to occupy the land roughly 475 million years ago, give or take, 25 million years or something. And the fossil record for plants is massive. It's really large. Because woody structures can be preserved reasonably well. And we break up the fossil record into plant fossil record into 5 eras, and we're going to see a slide of that. And according to this fossil record, the green algae appear first. They actually appear over 700 million years ago. Then the non-vascular plants, and we'll see this outlined in a moment, the seedless vascular plants, the seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. The gymnosperms show up most recently about 150 million years ago. And this timeline just shows you the timeline of plant evolution on the terrestrial land. Now, plants had to occupy the land before animals could, because animals needed some source of sustenance. So this was the first step in the beginnings, providing the beginnings for animal evolution on the land as well. So first evidence of land plants about 475 million years ago. And there are a couple of important features. One is a cuticle. Okay? We're going to come back to this cuticle, but it is a waxy substance that is found on the leaves or in covering seed or reproductive structure. It provides an impermeability to water, so it protects the seed or the spore from the loss of water. So it's a barrier to water exchange. Then the next step is the Solarian-Devonian explosion. And here, most of the morphological innovations in plants appear in this period of about 80 or so million years, from roughly 450 million years ago to about 360 million years ago. You have the appearance of stomata, which regulate gas exchange in leaves, and we're going to see a picture of that in a moment or two, so you don't need to worry. We have the appearance of vascular tissue, of roots, and of leaves, all back early in the terrestrial evolution of plants on Earth. And then the next phase is the Carboniferous, which is associated with these huge forests of giant ferns in swampy areas. Even at this stage, from up until about 300 million years ago, most of the terrestrial environment, or a lot of the terrestrial environment, wasn't occupied by plants because they had not gotten the adaptations that allowed them to live away from fairly wet, moist habitats. So the mountains were probably still denuded because the water wasn't there for this early plant life to live. It was confined to swampy areas. And it was during this period that these extensive coal-forming swamps existed. And then there's a big step forward with the appearance of the gymnosperms. And gymnosperms include conifers, pines, firs, also things like redwoods and yews. So they're a very, very important group of plants. Much of the boreal forest is made up of gymnosperms. They're really important for carbon sequestration, but they were with the appearance of gymnosperms, it was possible for plants to really occupy dry environments. So there was this efflorescence of plant life into environments that were not moist or swampy, and the earth became green at that point, the terrestrial earth, with the appearance of gymnosperms. And then finally, about 150 million years ago, we have the appearance of the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And we'll say more about each of these groups, particularly the gymnosperms and angiosperms, as we go along. So the next step then, we've looked now at two ways of analyzing them. We've looked at the morphological comparisons, and we've looked at the fossil record. And now we might want to take a look at the use of molecular phylogenies to analyze the appearance, the evolution of plants. And the results are quite consistent with the fossil record. First, they establish really compellingly that the green plants probably evolved from green algae, that the land plants evolved from green algae. Then they also show us that the green algal group, Characeae, is probably the sister group to land plants, meaning that they're the closest living relative of land plants in the algae. They tell us that the green plants are monophyletic, meaning that a single common ancestor gave rise to all land plants. And they tell us that the earliest branching of land plants were the nonvascular plants, which is consistent with the fossil record. In fact, the tree supports the hypothesis that water-conducting cells and tissues evolved gradually, and we'll see this more. The seed plants are within land plants. Seed plants are also monophyletic, and seeds and flowers evolved only once. So how do we see that? Well, we use DNA sequence data to build a phylogeny of algae and plants and land plants. And then we map on that phylogeny where important morphological features appeared. So you see at the very base, at the point where the algae appear, chloroplasts containing chlorophyll A and B and beta-carotene arise. And then we have the common ancestor of all green plants, and Characeae, the stoneworts, which is the closest, the sister group to all land plants. And then there is the ability to live on land, apparently evolved once. There's all of the plants that live on land trace back to a single common ancestor, mapped onto this phylogeny. And then further down, we see the appearance of the seedless vascular plants and the appearance of vascular tissue. Again, vascular tissue apparently appeared once, and then finally seeds, which also appeared once. So this gives us a way of mapping these important morphological traits onto the evolutionary history of plants, and it's really quite consistent with what we know from the fossil record. Well, why did plants bother? I mean, why life was going along just fine in the ocean. Why bother to try and invade the land? Well, there are a couple of good answers for that. If you're a photosynthetic organism, there's much better access to light in the land, out of the water, because the water attenuates light very quickly within just a few inches, really, there's a significant attenuation of light energy. So if you really want to harvest light, you want to get out of the water and do it more efficiently. And the second is that there's better access to carbon dioxide in the air. More of it, the rate of diffusion is better. So you need carbon dioxide to build those energy-rich molecules, things like glucose and cellulose and so forth. So it's nice to get where you've got more carbon dioxide. So you've got two things. You've got more energy, and you're able to get the essential inorganic resource, carbon dioxide, to build the molecules you need more effectively. So it makes them much more efficient. Now, I've tried to emphasize at this point, there are two really important things in plant evolution. One is the key thing is water. It's also key for us. You know, we have a skin, it's a major organ system that protects us from the loss of water. We're just big bags of water. We're about, I don't know, what, 75% or more water. And we have to contain that in a way that works. So plants have the same problem. They have to prevent water loss from their cells. And we already mentioned the cuticle as one strategy for doing that. And they have to be able to transport water to tissues which are outside of the water, which don't have direct access to water. Those are the two big things that plants had to do. And so in terms of preventing the loss of waters, the evolution of the cuticle was critical. It's absolutely critical. This is a waxy, watertight sealant that covers above ground parts of plants and gives them the ability to survive in dry environments. But there's a problem with this. Because it's an effective sealant, it inhibits gas exchange. Okay? If it inhibits gas exchange, how are you going to get your carbon dioxide in to carry out metabolism? So you've got a problem. You've solved one problem and created another. That's often the way life is. And so in this case, you solve that other problem by creating special pores that allow for gaseous exchange. Most of the structure, a leaf or whatever, is covered by the cuticle, can't do gas exchange, but there are special places where there's an opening for gas exchange, and these structures are called stoma, or stomata, which is the plural form. And gas exchange is accomplished through the stoma. And these just consist of an opening, or called a pore, but around it are specialized cells called guard cells, which can open and close. So they can shut off gas exchange if, for example, it is the middle of a 120-degree day in the Inland Empire, and you're going to be losing water faster through the pores than you gain in terms of carbon dioxide exchange, you close them. And then at night, when it cools down, you can open them and get your carbon dioxide source, but not have as large a loss of water. So here's what it looks like. This is really a fundamental adaptation. And it's a very simple and obvious one. Any engineer would design something like this too. It's a good, obvious solution to a problem. The bottom right panel shows the stoma, the opening into the intercellular portion of the leaf. And then right at the opening are these two specialized cells called guard cells. Now, if there's a lot of turgor pressure, the guard cells open. But if there is a loss of water and the water pressure inside the cell declines, they become flaccid and close. So that they close under periods of water stress, open and allow gas exchange under periods where water stress is not as great. And so you see the picture on the left shows you a larger cross-section of a leaf with a particular stoma shown. So this is the solution. Still the one used. We haven't gotten any, plants have not gotten any better at solving this problem. Plants are a compromise. They're a compromise between these two competing demands, gas exchange on the one hand and preventing the loss of water on the other. Now, I've already mentioned to you when we looked at the non-vascular plants that they're prostrate, they don't grow up, they don't have the structures that allow for erect growth. But if you're going to compete successfully, if you're going to be able to occupy a wider range of environments, it would be good to be able to grow up, because then you can get more light energy and maybe you can crowd out the other ones around you as well. So the evolution of vascular tissue solved this problem. It solved two problems. It's a great solution. It solved the structural problem by providing the structural support that allowed plants to grow up, but it also solved the problem of the transport of nutrients and water to other tissues in the plant. So let's look at the evolution of vascular tissue. The most primitive forms of vascular tissue are what are called simple conducting cells. These are not living. They were living, they developed, but then the cytoplasm was lost, and they become a channel for the transmittance of water. They, however, provide little structural support. The primary cell wall is cellulose, doesn't provide a lot of structural support. So the next thing that happened in evolution was the elaboration of a molecule called lignin, which is a polymer of sugars, but it's light and it provides a great deal of structural support under compression forces. And so the first vascular tissue had these lignin bands on the inside of what were essentially vessel elements, and that provided some structural support. And then this evolved further so that the whole inside, the whole secondary wall of what's called a tracheid is lignin, providing even more support. Now the conifers use tracheids. And they, redwoods can grow to 300 feet. So this provides a lot of structural support. Once again, these are dead cells that simply act as a tube that water and nutrients can be transmitted through. And then the final step in this evolution of water elements is the evolution of vessel elements. Incidentally, vessel elements arose twice independently in plant evolution, as far as we can tell. Once in the Nitales and once in the angiosperms, and we'll see that in a phylogeny in a few minutes. So these are found in Nitales and angiosperms, and they have these plates at the end. They're dead, and they connect end to end throughout the plant, and they provide a channel, a tube, for the transmission of water and nutrients. So here's the whole sequence, then, the whole evolutionary sequence of vascular tissue in land plants, from not shown, of course, as non-vascular, but then the beginnings of simple water-conducting elements to the first vascular tissue to tracheids to vessel elements, and the big changes have to do with providing structural support to allow plants to grow high out in the air. Now, the other key adaptation I mentioned is roots. Your book doesn't even mention plant roots. I can't imagine why, because that's one of the key organ systems. This is the part of the plant which is below ground, which can be in contact with a supply of water, from which water is transmitted to the rest of the plant. So it's the part of the plant that takes up most of the mineral nutrients that the plant gets. So the root system is also very important. Okay, so let's end today by just looking once again at these innovations. We begin with with spores or zygotes that are enclosed in a tough coat of impermeable material called sporopinellin. And then the cuticle and pores emerge, then the stomata. Vascular tissue arises both in the mosses and again later in the seedless vascular plants. Then we have roots and tracheids arise, followed by true leaves, followed by wood, and then finally the vessel elements, which you see arising both in the Nitales and in the angiosperms. So that's where we'll stop today, and we'll pick this all up on Monday. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Yes.